Hello and good afternoon to everyone. Hello, my name is Althea Rowe, and I'm Communications the Coordinator at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Thank you for joining us today for CAL's 8 Fundamental Principles of Effective Adult English Language Instruction. We are recording this webinar and will post the recording on cal.org after the event. Please mute your microphone and activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. The Center for Applied Linguistics is providing this event as a public service. The views expressed belong solely to the presenters. You may ask questions via the Q&A box, and we will try to address them during the presentation. However, you may also leverage a collective knowledge of our participants today and ask or answer questions in the chat. I will now pass the microphone to our facilitators.
Thank you, Althea. I'm Matilda Reckford. I'm the Adult Language and Communication Specialist at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Thank you for joining us.
And hi, everyone. I'm Kate Moran. I'm the Director of Adult Language and Communication, also at the Center for Applied Linguistics. If you were here with us for last week's webinar on Principles 1 through 4, we welcome you back. If you are just joining us this week, please know that you can watch the first webinar on our website. It is a pleasure to meet with you today and share some of the expertise of the Center for Applied Linguistics, especially with how it relates to language teaching. CAL is a nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we are dedicated to promoting access, equity, and mutual understanding for linguistically and culturally diverse people around the world. Established in 1959, CAL has earned an international reputation for contributions to many fields with a focus on the education of linguistically and culturally diverse adults and children. You might be familiar with CAL's suite of adult language assessments, the BEST assessments. BEST assessments address the needs of adult English language learners by providing assessment options that reliably demonstrate student progress, with BEST Plus to measure speaking and listening skills and BEST Literacy to measure reading and writing skills. Programs can test all 4 skill areas. Thank you again for joining us today, whether you're here live or you are reviewing the recording. We want to once again acknowledge the very valuable work that you are doing helping adults acquire English. We know that your job can be difficult, challenging, complicated, and that you pour your heart into it. And ultimately, I hope it's very rewarding for you. So we thank you for the work that you're doing. You do make a huge difference in the lives of your students. Before we get into today's content, this is the second part of our 2-part webinar series on CAL's Fundamental Principles of Effective Adult Education. We'll drop a link in the chat. In the resources section of that page, you can find the 8 principles as a downloadable resource, as well as last week's webinar recording and the slides from last week. So let's briefly review principles 1 through 4. Principle 1, effective instruction builds on adult learners' existing assets. We talked about 2 activities, a Google slide introduction activity and a learner survey activity to help you understand what assets your students are bringing to the classroom. Principle 2, effective instruction is clearly relevant to adult learners' needs. And for this one, we introduced using choice boards where you can differentiate activities to meet students with different needs, both proficiency levels, learning styles, and all sorts of things like that. And also information gap activities where students are asking and answering questions to find information and complete an activity. Principle 3 of effective instruction connects its methods with adult learners' goals. And for this one, we talked about how you can help your students write SMART goals. And we also talked about writing objectives as an instructor for your lessons. And the final principle we talked about last week was Principle 4, effective instruction integrates all communication modalities. And for that one, we talked about using a class story where a student orally describes a situation or an experience they've had, and the teacher writes the story on the board, and then asks comprehension questions of the class, and also the semi-scripted role play activity. I wanted to address two questions from last week. Last week, we did have some questions about writing objectives and how you might use objectives with students at beginning proficiency levels. This was something that we introduced with Principle 3, Effective Instruction Connects its methods with adult learners' goals. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and give you an example of how you can adapt objectives for students at beginning proficiency levels. So on the right, you can see what are teacher-facing objectives. So it might be, you might have something like students will be able to introduce themselves to a partner and respond using sentence frames or respond using a script. Students will be able to read a 2-paragraph story with key vocabulary highlighted, or write a list of objects found in the classroom with a small group using a dictionary. Remember that with each of these objectives, this is where you're trying to end up. So for the second objective, for example, you might start by building background and introducing vocabulary before students are reading with highlighted vocabulary as a support. So these objectives might be too difficult for your learners to understand, or they might even be overwhelming. So while you have these written for yourself to help you plan your lessons and help you think through supports that you're going to use, the student-facing objectives might look more like the objectives on the left. I can greet my partner. I can read a story. I can write a list. You'll notice the icons next to each objective. The first shows speaking, the second shows reading, and the third writing. Icons can be really helpful. You can introduce a simple icon for each modality: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And you want to consistently use the same icon with your students so you can show them what they look like. You can use them in your objectives like this. And then when you get to an activity that's focusing on speaking or reading, writing, or listening, you can show them that icon. So you can either hold it up on a printout or you could put it in the corner of your slide. But it helps the students mentally prepare for what you're doing next and where you're moving through the lesson. So that's a great way to scaffold objectives. Someone had also asked about what speaking to write activities are. We had talked about using some activities speaking before you go into writing. So these are any activities that allow students to speak about a topic before you would move into writing about the topic. Last week, we talked about the class story. That was an example because the student was orally telling an experience they've had, and then the teacher was writing it in simple sentences on the board. That one is scaffolded because the students aren't doing the writing yet, but the teacher is modeling how to put spoken language into writing. Anytime you're giving students an opportunity to discuss something orally first before moving into writing, it can be really helpful for them. So for example, if the goal is to have students write a paragraph summarizing a video they watched, they could start with a speaking activity where they discuss the main ideas of the video with a partner. And that would be an example of a speaking to write activity.
All right, so this webinar will focus on the 4 principles 5 through 8 of Cal's Fundamental Principles of Effective Adult Language Education that was developed by Burt, Kennedy, and Kuhn from the Center for Applied Linguistics in 2015. Those principles 5 through 8 are: 1, providing comprehensible input just above learners' levels, developing metacognitive awareness in learners and teaching directly specific features of the language, creating a supportive learning environment, and encouraging learners to take responsibility for their ongoing learning. So we will drop this document once again, and you can follow along as we walk through principles 5 through 8 in today's webinar. We like to start our professional development sessions with objectives. This way you can see what you should get out of this webinar, and we can reflect at the end of the session and assess whether we met these objectives. So at the end of this webinar, participants will be able to describe principles 5 through 8 of effective adult education and apply them consistently in their teaching, plan intentional groupings to foster language acquisition, and create a supportive learning environment, and create scaffolded activities that help learners stretch beyond their current level. So let's start with Principle 5. Effective instruction provides input that is just above the learner's current level.
Okay, thanks, Matilda. So when we're talking about providing input that is just above a learner's current level, we're really talking about what Krashen termed comprehensible input. So according to Krashen, language acquisition occurs when input is just beyond what a learner has already acquired. He calls this I+1, and I is the current level of acquisition, and 1 is being just above that. So another useful framework that you might be familiar with here is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, or ZPD. So Vygotsky posited that learning is a social process and that learners can achieve more with the support and guidance of a more knowledgeable other. This could be a teacher, or it could be a more advanced peer. And the zone is the space between what a learner can do on their own and what they cannot do yet. So working in that zone with support, with the help of a more knowledgeable other, can help the learner reach what they cannot do independently yet. So how do we best support students to be in their zone of proximal development, especially when our students might be at very different levels? To do this, I want to talk about scaffolding, because this is where careful, intentional scaffolding comes in. There are 3 types of scaffolding I think it's worth talking about. You can remember them with the acronym VIP: verbal, instructional, and procedural. These distinctions come from making content comprehensible, the SIOP model, but I think they're really helpful for teachers to think about, because it's nice to organize and think about all of the ways that you can, and that you often already are, scaffolding language acquisition for your students. So under verbal, some examples are encouraging students to elaborate, asking questions to help a student extend their answer, modeling think alouds for reading or for an activity where you're showing students your thought process as you move through it. Being really intentional and purposeful about using synonyms, antonyms, and cognates, and incorporating higher order thinking questions into activities when you're working with students. These are all verbal scaffolds that can help students stretch their language use. Instructional scaffolds are supports and tools that teachers implement to support learning. So we might think about graphic organizers as being a classic example of an instructional scaffold. Here, I would encourage even more scaffolding by making scaffolded graphic organizers. So I like to set up like 3 levels of graphic organizers and let my students choose which one they want. So maybe at the most scaffolded level within the graphic organizer, I might provide sentence frames and a word box. I might have images in there. And then maybe at the next level, I just have sentence frames or just the word box. And then finally, at the highest level with the least scaffolding, I might just have a table to use as an organizer, or some kind of a graphic that can help students structure their ideas. And then giving students a chance to choose which graphic organizer, which level of scaffolding they want for that activity can be a great way for them to assess their own learning. You can, of course, walk around and make sure that they're using one that's right for them. But it's a good way for them to monitor their learning and to stretch a little bit. If they want to try one that's less scaffolded, they can always move back down. So other instructional scaffolds include any manipulatives or realia that you're using, resources you teach students to use that are in the classroom, maybe like a dictionary or a thesaurus. Those are also often available online or on their phones. Using visuals, using labeled visuals in the classroom. Those are examples of instructional scaffolds. Procedural scaffolds are all about grouping techniques and how you structure activities. But these also include a teaching framework that will include modeling, practicing, and applying. You might be familiar with a gradual release model, sort of I do, you watch, I do, you help, then moving to you do, I help, and then finally at the application stage, you do, I watch. Other procedural activities, procedural scaffolding activities are think, pair, share, doing reading jigsaws, being really intentional about how you're grouping students together, whether it's heterogeneous or homogeneous for a particular activity. All right, let's move on to some things we can do in the classroom. So in the classroom, you can plan for a variety of scaffolding types. You can try to make sure you're touching on verbal scaffolds, instructional and procedural scaffolds. Be really thoughtful and strategic when you're grouping students for activities. If you do this all the time, if you're constantly changing up groups and telling students who they're going to meet with, you can set up the groups ahead of time and display them on the board, or call out names, or have them kind of pre-done so it's not a big disruption when students are moving around. But they get really used to being in different groups and working with different people the more you do it. You also want, the really important piece of scaffolding is to remember that it's not intended to be a permanent support. You need to reduce and remove the scaffolds as students progress. We're trying to get them toward that independent work. So as they're getting stronger and their language acquisition is improving, then we want to gradually reduce those scaffolds. And of course, when you're introducing new content, you may need to put some scaffolds back in place, but encourage students also to begin to see where they can kind of reduce some of the scaffolding that they need. All right.
All right, let's look at 2 activities to foster the principle of providing input that is just above the learner's current level. So the Talking Chips discussion activity is a Kagan cooperative learning strategy that you may have used before. So we're going to look at how you can scaffold this activity to support your learners. So you want to put your students in a group of between 3 and 5 students. And just like we said, be strategic about your grouping, and get to know your students to be really strategic about your grouping. And in this activity, heterogeneous grouping works very well because higher level students can provide a model for lower proficiency students. So when students are in their group, each student gets a token. So tokens can be anything: paper clips, pennies, bingo chips, pens, pencils, old board game pieces like checkers. And students take turn contributing to a discussion. So when they speak, they put their token in the center, and no one can speak unless they have a token. So all students must use all their tokens, and once all tokens are in the center, each student can take a token back and continue the conversation. So this way, everyone gets an equal chance to speak, but also eager speakers can provide a model for more reluctant speakers. As a teacher, you can scaffold the discussion with sentence frames and images, and we'll look at examples of that. And this type of activity also can lead to a writing activity afterwards. So things that you can talk about, you can do a content-based discussion, something related to the lesson topic that you're covering, or you can do general icebreaker warm-up conversations. And like we said, you can provide a question or an image for discussion, but make sure to avoid sensitive topics and images. So here's an example of an image prompt for a conversation with the prompt, "What is happening in this picture?" So you can have students go in order of the sentence frames that you can see here on the right. So for example, student 1 would say, "I think this picture is in the winter because there's a lot of snow." And then they would put their token down, and then the next students has to say, "It looks like there's a person stuck in the snow," etc., etc. So you would go down this list of sentence frames. And for lower level students, it could be, "What do you see in this picture?" It could be a more simple prompt, and the sentence frames could just be I see snow, I see sheep. The sentence frame could be I see, and then they can kind of fill in the blank with what they see. Another example that might be a little higher level would be kind of an opinion conversation. So in this case, time is money. Do you agree or disagree? And students can take turns, and they can learn from the sentence frames here about different ways that they can express their opinion. Okay.
Thank you, Matilda. I saw a question. I'm going to talk a little bit about graphic organizers here, specifically using with language functions. But I did notice a question in the chat about how students can use graphic organizers to kind of monitor their own learning. So what I was talking about is if you scaffold your graphic organizer, maybe if it were something like the one you're looking at here, for example, you might fill in some of the spaces on that spider chart. You might provide a sentence frame to answer that question in addition to the words in the word box. Then at the next level, maybe you have the sentence frame, but you haven't put anything in the spider part of the graphic organizer. And then maybe the highest level either looks like this or it doesn't have the kind of language needed. So that would be the least scaffolded version. By having those three available and letting students kind of choose which graphic organizer they think they want to work with, they can do this also in groups. That's sort of a way for them to kind of monitor their own learning, right? Do I need more support? I'm going to try. I tried the really supported one last time. I'm going to try the one that's a little less supported and see how I do. That way they can always move back to something that's more scaffolded, but it's a nice way to encourage them to stretch a little as well. So these graphic organizers that are on this slide are specifically for language functions. Again, remember you would make them specific to the context and learning that you're doing, but there are two here. So the first one is about listing. And so in that spider organizer, they would write the object or person that they're going to list attributes about in the center, and then write the attributes or characteristics around that circle. And then they're trying to answer the question, what are the attributes of this object or person? And so language that they need to do that are things like such as, include, others, for example. So you can model this with your students before having them go on their own and write the sentence. But ultimately, this graphic organizer points toward that function. Below it, you see one for cause and effect. And so students would start by writing a cause and an effect in the box to answer the question. That should say, what is the cause and effect of this event? And then there's some language provided for that function, right? So words that show cause and words that show effect. And again, you can scaffold these further as your students might need. I want to show you one more that looks at compare and contrast. I really like this one on the top. I find Venn diagrams that center, especially if you're drawing them yourself, that center overlap tends to be really hard to write in because it's very small. So this is another way to organize, compare and contrast with that top organizer. So the two things that are being compared would go in the circles for A and B. The ways that they're different go on the far left and far right. And then the ways that they're the same go in those boxes in the middle. So it's a nice visual, gives them a little bit more room than a Venn diagram. And then they're answering questions. How are they similar? How are they different? And again, we've provided some language for that particular function on the right-hand side of the graphic organizer. So that, again, your students might need more support than this, but this is a good starting place, especially thinking about functional language, these sorts of things that are not the same as those concrete words that we think about teaching, vocabulary words that we might think about teaching. These are some that come up across a lot of contexts. We consider them kind of tier 2 vocabulary words. And so it can be really helpful to teach that type of language and provide some instruction in words that we sometimes don't think about teaching directly. All right.
So now let's look at Principle 6. Effective instruction includes direct teaching of specific features of the language. Adult learners need to develop metacognitive awareness. They need to develop an understanding of the nature and structure of the language. So make sure you do some direct instruction of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax as related to the different tasks and topics that you are covering. And after you've introduced the grammar, syntax, and vocabulary, use activities to practice and reinforce the students' understanding of these specific features of the language. Also, make sure it makes sense within your current lesson. So if you're teaching conjugation, use verbs that your students already know from previous lessons or the lesson that you're covering now. So let's look at 2 activities to foster the principle of teaching specific features of the language directly. So this activity is battleship. So you would put students in pairs and they would have a grid with a grammar point to practice. And to practice it, they'll play the game of battleship. So they'll have this grid and they'll mark their ships on the grid with X's. And they'll try to find their partner's ships by saying the construction that you represented in the grid. And as in the grid, you're also supporting. You can also support with images. So here we have some verbs, but we also have images next to those verbs for lower proficiency levels, and sentence frames that your students are actually going to directly use as they're playing the game. And you can also use more complex phrases for higher proficiency levels. So in this example on the right, the grammar point is can, can't. So you would have taught this before, but here you want to reinforce it with this activity. So you take the time to explain the game, explain some of the basic things that would happen in the game, and the vocabulary of, you know, a battleship, a submarine, and the sentence, "You sunk my ship." And then you want to demonstrate the sentences that they're going to use to practice this. So the kind of A1 box here in this example is you and cook, right? So you're going to demonstrate that the partner is maybe going to guess that the other person has put a ship there, and so they want to ask. And so they're going to have to say, "Can you cook?" And if the partner has a ship there, then they would use that other sentence frame that's also provided here, and they would say, "Yes, you can." So this is a really fun activity because students get to be in pairs. And like we said before, you can really intentionally pair students here. And you can pair higher students together, for instance, and have them practice more complex phrases. They can practice the past tense, for instance. And then it also highlights vocabulary that they already know. They would already know these verbs most likely, but they would use them here in the context of practicing a sentence structure. So yes, that's it.
Great. I love that battleship activity. I also love this one that I'm going to introduce, but it's not quite as much fun as battleship. This one is called writing from boxes. And it's a great way to scaffold writing and also to practice syntax, grammatical forms, and vocabulary. So for this one, students will form sentences by choosing words from each column in the box. So in the top example, a student might choose you, and then they have to choose the right form of the verb like. You like to help others. Or Alana likes, with the S, to read books. The second example practices the present continuous. So a sentence could be, they are talking with an expert. And we also added that prepositional phrase with on the end of it, or she is studying with Sarah. So it's a great activity, not only for reviewing and reinforcing syntax or grammar, but it also supports students in forming and writing sentences that they might not quite be ready to form on their own. So they can do this orally with a partner first and practice making sentences back and forth. And then they can write some of the sentences that they formed. And then as an extension, they can form new sentences using this structure as a model. So they'll have written, maybe she likes to teach yoga, and then they can write their own sentence using that as a model and filling in those, keeping the like, maybe keep the she, but maybe you're changing, instead of teach yoga, she likes to swim laps. I don't know. So that they can work on filling in those slots, those open slots in the sentence frame. So somebody had a question about battleship. So Matilda, do you want to address that really quickly? She was saying she didn't understand what the battleship is used for.
So the grid is used for placing ships that will prompt the other students to ask, whether you have a ship there that you've kind of placed. So they'll ask you using one of the sentence structures, and then you'll look at your grid where you've placed your actual ships, and then you'll answer yes or no using the kind of grammar that you want to practice. And then you're trying to guess where they place their ships. And so every time you want to guess whether there's something there, whether it's a hit or a miss on that specific point in the grid, they sing, she dances, right? Like trying to really triangulate what would be the sentence here. And then so with she and dances, that the sentence structure has to be can she sing. And so you're kind of forced to think about that sentence structure to ask your partner whether there's something there or not. And then it's their turn and they ask you, using the sentence structure, can we paint? And then you look at your grid and you see whether you have a ship there or not. And you would say, yes, we can, or no, we can't.
Yeah, like that's great. Thank you for explaining that a little bit more, Matilda. This is a good one. If you take a minute as a teacher to kind of look at it and think through, if you've ever played Battleship as a kid, it's a lot less confusing in person when you can kind of model how to do this with your students. The X's are the ships, yes. So they would do 4 X's for that big battleship, and then they do 3 X's in a row to represent the submarine, and then they have 2 that are made up of 2 X's to be a destroyer. So again, know your students. It's a fun activity. It is a fun activity to use, but sometimes it's also trial and error. Try it out with your students. Doesn't go well the first time, you can decide to either put it away or try it again later. But it is really a fun one.
Yeah, and the H's are hits and the M's are miss. So you're trying to get as many hits. You're trying to get, if you're trying to sink a submarine, which has 3 X's, you're going to try and hit the 3 that they've placed. And then you win the game by having sunk all your partner's ships.
Yeah. I'm seeing some great alternatives coming up in the chat box, so make sure you check there because there are some other cool activities in there. All right, so moving on to principle 7, effective instruction creates and maintains a supportive learning environment. Last week we did talk about using Google Slides as a way for students to introduce themselves, and also creating a learner survey or learner profile. Those are also things you can do to help create a supportive learning environment. We'll talk about a few more today, but I wanted to point that out. So in the classroom, here are some things that you could do that definitely help create that environment we want for our students. The first one is definitely to learn and use your students' names. Really try your best to pronounce them correctly. Ask your students, let them correct your pronunciation, practice, but use their names. It goes a long way toward making a really inviting and warm classroom. Another one is to just check in with your students regularly. Ask them how they're doing, how their day was, how their weekend was. Engage in small talk before and after class. You can even provide simple sentence frames for the small talk and just have them on the board. And then as students are moving in or out of class, it's a nice way for them to practice and maybe even give them a chance to talk with somebody in class that they might not have spoken with. We want to try to lower their affective filter. The affective filter is when negative feelings like a lack of motivation or low self-confidence and anxiety can really hinder learning. And so one way to do that is through doing a lot of confidence boosting activities. So we'll talk about a good one for confidence boosting in just a minute. Another thing is to normalize making mistakes. We know making mistakes is a crucial part of language learning. If students aren't making mistakes, then it's really hard to help them grow. So students really need to make mistakes in order to improve. So we want to make sure that we're, normalizing making mistakes, but also providing meaningful feedback to our students when they do make mistakes. And one other thing to consider is allowing ample time for students to think and process before sharing out. We want to build that think time into the activity so it feels natural and it's not like, the crickets chirping while everybody's waiting for somebody to say something, because that is definitely anxiety producing. We're trying to create an environment where learners feel comfortable taking risks, asking questions, and responding to challenges. So we're going to talk about two activities for Principle 7, Effective Instruction Creates and Maintains a Supportive Learning Environment. And the first one we'll talk about is an oldie but a goodie, the good old think, pair, share. You may be very familiar with this one, but I do think it's a really valuable activity for adult learners. Because we're giving that think time, that wait time, and really just lowering the anxiety of being put on the spot or called on to share an answer before you're ready. So for Think, Pair, Share, for those of you who may not be familiar, before students respond to a teacher prompt, you give them time to work independently, to think through their answers or to answer the prompt. That's the think part. You could give them a graphic organizer like just very, very simple, like the one I have here on this slide, just a column for them to write down their own ideas, a space for them to write down their partner's ideas, and then a space to write down the whole class ideas. So after a specified amount of think time, and I would set a timer, and it depends on the activity, but it could be 1 to 3 minutes, depending on how complex the activity is. After that, then they pair up with another student and share their answers with each other. They write down some of what their partner's ideas were, which may be the same or maybe different from their own ideas. And then after everyone's had a chance to work with their partner, discuss their ideas, then you can call on pairs to share out to the whole group. So Think, Pair, Share, there's a lot of variations on it. They all work really well, but it's a great way to build in that independent think time, give students a chance to practice first with a partner before they're sharing out to the whole class, which can really help with reducing anxiety. Matilda's going to show our next activity.
Yes, so this is a good activity for boosting your students' confidence. It's called the song activity. And so you would have some groups of students stand in a circle around a table, maybe 5 students per table, but you could have everyone in the same room, just different groups around different tables. And each table would have some pieces of paper with vocabulary from a song that you're going to be playing. And everyone has their hands behind their back. And as you're going to play the song, they're going to have to grab the piece of paper as they hear it come through in the song as quickly as possible. So the way you would start this activity, especially with beginner levels, is that you would uncover these words on the tables and practice the pronunciation first, maybe go over the meaning of the words. But one thing that would really also boost your learners' confidence is to pick words that they might know already, and this would boost their confidence. I would say pick around maybe 10 words that would happen throughout the song. Maybe every 2 or 3 lyric line there would be a new word that they should be ready to grab on the table. And After the activity is done, you can play the song one more time, hand out the lyrics, see if they can find those vocabulary words as they read along. This is really a booster in confidence when it comes to listening comprehension. This is typically something that learners say that they kind of struggle with. They picture themselves in a context with, you know, native speakers, and a context of listening to a song where they're just like, it's too fast, I can't understand. And you do realize with this activity that students of really any level are going to be very concentrated and are going to be able to pick out these words in the song. So I picked 2 songs here for the example. The first little grouping is the song, are words from the song Take Me Home, Country Road by John Denver. I think this would be a good one to use as part of a lesson, maybe on US geography, especially if you're in the DC area like us. It could be a good way to kind of introduce, you know, your students' region, talk to them about what they know. Maybe they know about the Shenandoah Park, which is mentioned in the song. You can pick songs about different cities in the US, and there's I think a lot of things to do about just students talking about different cities, talking about what they know, and kind of including the song activity in that context. And then the second song is are words that I picked out from A Horse with No Name by George Martin. And you can see some of the words I picked are more related to nature and weather. And so that could also be included in a lesson on those topics. And yeah, it's a really fun activity, and it's a real confidence booster in listening comprehension. And now let's talk about Principle 8. Effective instruction encourages learners to take responsibility for their ongoing learning. So in the classroom, we encourage to teach learning strategies that learners can use and practice. So as they continue learning the language, they can use these strategies in new contexts. So we can think about reading strategies, mnemonic devices for learning vocabulary, cognates. A strategy is going to reside in a learner's head, and then they can use them to make sense of a new concept, a new word. And you as a teacher, you should explicitly teach those strategies. You should give them a name and give opportunities to practice those strategies in class, and practice them in different contexts in class. And then gradually they can move on to applying them outside of class. So strategies are a conscious practice. This is when it's not automatic yet, but they will become a skill when they become automatic. So learners will move between strategies and skills, and they'll consciously apply a strategy at first when they learn something new, and then they'll practice it until it becomes automatic in that situation. You can think, for example, of when maybe you first learned to drive a car. First, you had to really think about what you needed to do, and now you do it automatically. So we also encourage to provide your students with opportunities to demonstrate critical thinking skills. Learning or practicing language that uses critical thinking skills will help with continual learning. And then encourage out-of-class learning with practices such as a vocabulary notebook, conversation logs, reading logs, or a journal. So these examples are kind of similar to habit trackers, and they have this value that they help students be accountable to their goals and continue learning outside the classroom. And so a way that you could use a conversation log maybe outside the classroom is that you would write on a specific day that you spoke for 2 minutes at the supermarket, and you would just write that down in your log, and then you would maybe write how you felt about that conversation. Kate, I think you're muted.
I am muted because I was typing in the chat box and I didn't want my loud typing to interrupt you. Thanks for letting me know. So we're going to look at a couple of activities to foster Principle 8, which is effective instruction, encourages learners to take responsibility for their ongoing learning. So the first one we're going to look at is related to vocabulary. It's a vocabulary concept map. And the reason that, can you advance to the next slide, please? Thanks. The reason this one is helpful for ongoing learning is it's a great strategy for visualizing vocabulary words or concepts, not just as isolated words, but within a context of information, which is really helpful for retaining what those words mean. So in something like a concept map, and this is something students can practice in class, but also bring to things that they're learning outside of class or other words that they might come into contact with in their everyday lives. So they would write the word in that, I'll show you an example, but in that square, that rectangle right above, what are some examples? And then above that, write a simple definition. Then write down some examples of that word or concept and key vocabulary that's related to that word. So one example might be using the word vehicle on the next slide. And so we'd write a short definition of vehicle, give some examples of different vehicles, and then write some related vocabulary. So wheels, transport, transportation, another great word with prefixes and roots and suffixes. Engine, to drive, we could have license in there. But this is an idea of how students could map vocabulary in a meaningful way to contribute to their learning and retention, and something they can do beyond your class. There's other examples. Concept maps don't work well for all types of words. But in that case, you might try something like a Frere model. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in that one, the students would write the word in the center and then use 4 quadrants on their paper to give a definition, maybe draw a picture or an image, write some examples and then some non-examples. So these are things that students can continue to use outside of your class as they're learning new vocabulary and new concepts. Another one is a reading log. Matilda had talked about reading logs and conversation logs. These are just very simple, almost habit trackers for students to keep track of their interactions, either with reading or with speaking, that they can keep in a notebook. So it's intended to be very straightforward, standard, and very simple, should not take a lot of time, but can be really helpful with goal setting and letting students see how much they're actually reading or how often they're having conversations. So for a reading log, students could keep a notebook, or they could even do a digital record in have a Google document that's just ongoing, where they log reading. And this is just an example. This just has 3 things on it: what they read, 3 words, new words, and something they learned from the reading. Now, reading does not need to be a full book or a full article or anything like that. It can be absolutely any print source that your students might be reading. Could be flyers, could be emails, websites, could be a portion of a magazine article, could be something in the news. But we want to keep those entries really standard and very simple. In this example, this was an email. It was a class newsletter. So I read my son's class newsletter. 3 words I learned: evaluate, characteristics, multiples. And then they put the sentence that those words occurred in. And something I learned: my son has a test on Friday. So it doesn't have to be, and you can, of course, scaffold this more, but it doesn't have to be very formal or very long. It's more so that students are seeing how often they're reading, and it's giving them a chance to process their reading in a new way. So looking for vocabulary and trying to come up with something that they've learned from this, whatever it is that they've read. All right, so this is our last activity for Principle 8. So I'm going to turn it back over to Matilda now. We are a little bit over time.
We have reached the end of the webinar, so let's review our objectives. You can give a thumbs up here on Zoom if you feel like we met the objectives. So at the end of this webinar, we plan for participants to be able to, 1, describe principles 5-8 of effective adult education and apply them consistently in their teaching. 2, plan intentional groupings to foster language acquisition and create a supportive learning environment. And finally, create scaffolded activities that help learners stretch beyond their current level. And then here is a reference slide. And as we've mentioned in the chat, we'll put up these slides online in that page that we've linked in the chat.
Yeah, thank you all so very much for participating today in our second webinar in our series on CAL's 8 fundamental principles of effective adult language instruction. Please do remember that we've recorded both webinars and they will be available on our website. I know there were a lot of questions in the chat about creating online materials. I would love to talk more about that. Our time was kind of limited, but please be on the lookout because we're looking to develop more professional development for adult language educators. And that's why we want you to complete our survey that Matilda just put up there. If you've completed it already, you don't have to do it a second time. But if you could take some time to complete that survey, we appreciate it.
Yes, we'll put the link in the chat for the survey, or you can scan the QR code. It's also linked on the last slide of last week's webinar. That you can find the slide for on CAL's website. And we are interested in learning more about your professional development needs. And yes, please let others know that you can find this web recording of this webinar on CAL's website and that they can complete the survey as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.